that we have our search component, we might actually want to be able to use this component multiple times. Because if we look at the code for our input, all it is just an input that doesn't need any local state. Even though it seems like we're calling setState in our input, it's really just a function that we're passing from the context of our app component into the onChange handler of our input. But this means that we can probably move this into its own component because maybe we want to have a reusable search component. Well, how would we do this? Well, let's just make a new component called searchbox. And we'll create the usual file, searchbox.component.jsx. Now, some of you might have noticed, why is it that some of our files have .jsx and some have .js? Well, you remember how I mentioned earlier that Create React App hides away some of the configuration for Webpack and Babel? Well, what Babel does is it helps transpile down any of the modern JavaScript, including JSX style files that we write, into older versions of JavaScript in the public folder when we finally run our build script inside of our scripts file. Now, in this transform, if we look at our .js file for app.js, we actually see that it says JavaScript Babel down here. So even though we're writing JSX code here, right, because we're rendering HTML in our JavaScript, Babel knows that it should probably run this regardless through a JSX transform, even though it's not a .jsx file type. We'll explore this much later in the course when we actually write our own Webpack and Babel configurations, but right now just know that whether or not you write .js or .jsx in the context of Create React App, you can write JSX in both file types. But we want to write .jsx in ours because we want to be explicit. We want to know that if we're going to write JSX, well, this file type is JSX. We're also going to create our searchbox.styles.css. And I've included the styles for you, and you can find it in your resources. So you just want to copy that file and paste it in. And then you want to import it into our searchbox component. So let's first import React from React. And then let's import in our style sheet. Now we're going to use another functional component. Now let's go a little deeper about functional components. So functional components, unlike class components, such as our app.js component, they don't have access to state because they don't have access to constructor, which is a class method on our component that we import from React, that we extend our class from. They also don't have access to lifecycle methods. They don't have internal state and lifecycle methods because we don't always need to use lifecycle methods or internal state. Sometimes all we want to do is render some HTML. And that's what a functional component really is. Unlike a class component, a functional component is just a component that gets some props and returns some HTML. And we'll figure out as we build our apps and see more challenges when to use each. But for now, the main thing to remember is that if you don't think you need internal state nor access to lifecycle methods, then just use a functional component because it's easier to read. It's actually easier to test, as we'll see later in the course. And it's in some ways smaller and easier to reason about. So we'll just copy over the input that we want inside of our searchbox component. And we'll apply a class name of search to it because that's where our searchbox styles are applying those styles to. We'll keep this type because we know that it's going to be search. And then as far as placeholder goes, we might want this to be dynamic because maybe another place that wants to use searchbox doesn't want the placeholder to say search monsters. Let's say they want to search people or anything else. We want placeholder to be a prop that gets passed in. And as we learned with our destructure, we can destructure that prop off of the props object because all the props come in as one big object. So let's destructure it off and then pass it into our placeholder. And then onChange can be another prop that gets passed in, which is a function under the name of handleChange. And we'll destructure that one off as well. And then we will replace the value inside of our change right here. Now let's export our search box out. And then inside of our app.js, we can import it in and start using it. So let's import in our search box. From components, search box component. Now in order to replace our input, we are just going to copy over some of those properties. Now we know that type is already on our search box component, so we don't need this. We do need the placeholder because we want to be a prop that we pass in. And then instead of handleOnChange, we're going to say handleChange, and then we'll pass in this function. And now let's get rid of our input. And if we go back to our application, we'll see there's our search box. And we've still got our functionality. But now we've got a reusable component that we can use in multiple places. And this is what's great about React, is this component-driven style of writing code. Our search box is just a presentational component that pretty much styles an input. And then it takes any functionality that it might need in its handleChange property. But now we have this reusable search box component. And this is great because we can minimize the amount of repeat code that we have. We don't have to write an input and then style it inside of a local file because we can separate it into its own component. This will become much more apparent as we start building larger and larger applications where more of the code gets reused. Right now, the benefits might not be so obvious, but it's definitely the style that we want to code in. And this is one of the huge advantages of React, is writing these smaller and smaller reusable components. Okay, now let's continue.